Whoa, we're live!
We're
Hey,
live.
awesome! Thank you so much for agreeing to do this, Damon.
Of
This
course.
really nice of you.
Yeah, I'm gonna share the link right now to this.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah.
Awesome.
I'll take a second and do the same.
Okay.
Here. If I can.
Okay.
So I'm still looking around for the public link.
I found it just went to your channel.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow. That works.
What's up, Faith? Faith is in here.
Oh, cool. Oh.
Yes. Faith
Awesome.
is one of the people that watches my videos a lot, but she's also pagan.
Oh, cool.
So
very nice.
So through her and a couple others who watch my videos, who happen to be pagan, I've realized like I need to get myself way more educated on paganism.
Well, happy to do what I can to help. Certainly, it's a huge field. Heaven knows. It's no, yeah. I'm still learning. I'm still learning a bunch. My goodness.
Yeah.
But yeah. So what? Oh, hey, evening.
Okay, I shared it.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it. You've been doing some great stuff over on your channel, and any of my friends out there who haven't checked out Damon's stuff yet, I highly recommend. This will be here when you get back. This will be here when you've checked out a couple of things of his. That's cool. Nice. There was one of the first books I read about kind of magic and paganism and stuff in America was a book called Not in Kansas Anymore by Christine Wicker. It's a little bit dated now, but I bet it would be a great intro to anybody out there with questions, and especially about the larger community. In broad strokes, it's told from the perspective of a pretty average woman. She's a Christian. She's a journalist. She's written about religion for a long time, and she tells her story of sort of discovering these scenes. And some of the first people that she really goes in deep with are the hoodoo practitioners. So they're Christian. They're generally Protestant, living throughout America, oftentimes African American. But there's a lot of prayer in it, but also this root work and working with spirits of plants and working with things like High John the Conqueror, who is this culture hero who has plants associated with him, High John the Conqueror root, that sort of thing. And even when it comes to things like, what we call voodoo dolls or that sort of thing, where you're hexing somebody or you're trying to create what they call crossed conditions, a lot of them will, some people won't do it. They'll just, they'll concentrate on the light side, and that's okay. That's one way to do it. But another way that people will do is they'll think up, whatever they want for this person who's wronged them, and then they sort of slough it off, and they say, and they put it all on God and say, if this be justified, Lord, then let it come to pass. And they leave it up to him, which, I think that's a smart thing, especially depending on how nasty you get in your in your magical vengeance.
Yeah. I grew up in evangelicalism, or Pentecostal conservative Christian church, and actually what's funny is there was a lot of, I think, what everyone outside of Pentecostalism would refer to as magic, or everyone outside of Christianity would refer to as magic. And we wouldn't say that because magic's of the devil. This is Jesus stuff. And so it's like, but it was healing. There was prophecy. There was speaking in tongues. There was getting
Altered
demons
states
out
of
of people.
consciousness.
So it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
So it was, and so I grew up around a lot of that supernatural. And as I grew older, I started to doubt a lot of it and feeling like, because I saw a lot of things that people would pray for and not happen, and to see bad excuses for it. And but then also growing up, I was told like that paganism and occult and even new age, that would all be stuffed together, and it was evil and demonic, and
Yeah.
those people were talking to evil demons and they're lost. And so as I have grown older and have come out of evangelicalism through just learning and deconstructing and just learning more and being more honest about those convictions, I've come to be affirming of everybody of other faiths, but specifically occult stuff has been like the most difficult because there's so much, like you said in the beginning, there's so much. It's difficult compared to like certain religions where it's like, here's the religion, here's their text, here's what they believe, where it's easier to like go through that and be like, okay, I could affirm that, I could affirm that. But with this, which maybe because it's more based in practices, paganism, it's a little bit more difficult to grasp. And it's like, I still have little voices, little loyal soldier voices from my childhood being like, hey, that's not right. And so then I have to tell those voices to shut up.
Oh, believe you me, I get that. And it's, it's interesting because I come from almost an entirely opposite background. My parents both left their respective faiths. Well, they stopped practicing and raised us kids more or less secular, but just celebrating the various holidays. So I've got a very interesting like interfaith family story, and I was always curious about like interrogating my little friends at school about, so what happens in church?
Yeah.
What happens in temple? What do you do? And just always being super curious, and then discovering paganism in middle school, and finding that it really clicked with me. Trying to reclaim some of my Jewish roots in college as well, and not so much, and that's not as much in the mix these days. But there's a lot of there's a lot of strange coincidences, like a lot of ceremonial magic, even that's used in, say, Wicca. Those ceremonies come down to them from groups like the Order of the Golden Dawn over in England in the 19th century, who were getting them not from, ancient druids or whatever, but from people who were nominally Christian, creating these rituals based on Hebrew Kabbalah and the Greco-Christian magic that they were extrapolating from the Kabbalah, really. And it's so there's some strange coincidences there, but these days I am a Thelemite. I accept the law of Thelema. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will. And I worship the Celtic pantheon. So the insular Irish Celtic, the Tuatha De Danann, which is interesting because the only reason we know about them is because of course, Christian chroniclers who set them down not as gods, because you can't have monks talking about other gods, but they were super powered people, and the peasants need these stories. We can get them into church. We'll get them to celebrate our holidays. We'll get them to do mass. But if you try to take away these stories, oh boy. And
Wow.
so So in the Christian Chronicles of Ireland, you have these superpowered people with magical weapons going around, and and the reason supposedly that they're not there anymore is because of the flood of Noah. So they were part of the generations that were supposedly wiped out in the flood, and because everybody had magical powers back in those the antediluvian days.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So yeah, no, the anybody who worships the Celtic tradition, or has anything to do with the Celtic deities, has the Christian chroniclers of Ireland to thank, and the British Isles more generally. But yeah,
Yeah, that's funny. It reminds me how the Christianity has always been very diverse and different groups believing different things. And even the lost Christianities, we know about them because of the people condemning them as heresy, the theologians saying, here's this group of heretics, here's this group of heretics. And now we get to know about them.
Sorry.
So now we get to know about them, even though I'm sure they would have liked for everyone to forget about them. But it's like, it's to our benefit that they documented that, even though they're condemning them.
Yeah. No, it's wild. I've always been curious about like the Cathars in France, and various groups. Also here in the so-called New World, I live in Rhode Island, and just a little drive north of us, there's a place out in Massachusetts called Marymount, and there was a group of colonists that went out there. And the Puritans got really spooked, because according to the court papers, they were having wild orgies with the Indians in the woods, and they had set up a maypole, and they were dancing around the maypole and having heathen all kinds of good times that the Puritans weren't too down with.
Whoa!
Oh yeah,
that's and I wonder too, like how much. It's like there's all these stories of the witches that they wanted to burn at the stake that they developed, and I wonder like what what the reality was, what they were actually witnessing and confusing.
Yeah. Well, a lot of it was, your typical hedge doctor, herbalist, old woman with a cat.
Yeah.
A lot of people have speculated that there was ergot in the bread, this fungus that gives us a little chemical called LSD-25.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, you can imagine you can imagine these folks with no other source of calories, just tripping out on this this spoilt bread.
That's interesting. It's also funny. You make me remember that when Christianity first started in the 1st and 2nd century, they also had a lot of wild rumors spread about them, actually from pagans, which were different type of people than what pagans are now. But they, like, I know some of the big rumors were that they were having incestual orgies because they had to meet at nighttime and they called each other brother and sister. So the confusing telephone game of that made them think they were having incestual orgies at night. And the other thing is that they were cannibals, and that they're eating babies because they heard that they had some ritual where they're eating the body and blood of the son of somebody. And so that turned into that. And so,
oh, wow.
Yeah.
No, that makes perfect sense, though. I read an article a while back about how whenever Rome wanted to conquer somebody, like there was this new tribe causing trouble on the border or something, and they needed more land to give their soldiers or what have you, they would start spreading rumors about these tribes and it was always the same damn thing. They're eating people. We got to stop them eating people. And it's, that's just, it's the same imperial rumor over and over again. And it's just like conservatives today. They have one joke. Yeah, but it's
yeah, you're right. That's interesting.
We got to stop these people. They're eating people. But it reminds me of nothing more than some of Paul's letters where he's telling the women to like wear the tight Roman coiffure and and dress very respectably, because the loose hair was associated with these cults like those of Aset, Isis, and Dionysus, the wine and theater god, because they would tear their hair loose and run riot in the streets, and so they were like mass deportations of these cults to, I think, Sardinia at one point. And so Paul was extremely image conscious, probably because of these stories that were going around.
Yeah.
That's
interesting. There is a lot of prohibitions in the Old and New Testament that are completely rooted in identity markers. Like, we have to distinguish ourselves from the neighboring tribes. So don't wear this, do wear this. Like Leviticus saying, don't cut the corners of your beard. We found like ancient
put this on your door
ruins of that. Yeah. Or we found ancient ruins of a neighboring tribe who cut the sides of their beard and hair. And so that command was a way of saying we are different from that tribe, so don't do that. So there's a lot of weird stuff like that. Yeah.
That's interesting. And it is remarkable because they're in this corner of the world where they're just getting conquered so much.
Yeah.
And there's probably every century there's a new big boss, and you've got there's all this pressure to assimilate. And it's there's always a question, what do you keep and what do you give away? And so it's interesting because with the resurgence of pagan religion, there's big questions about what to keep and what to give away, and even beyond that, what's real and what's pardon me. So there's misinformation, disinformation, and then romantic fiddle faddle that's just been made up out of whole cloth. I could go on and on about like these foppish gentlemen's clubs from the 1700s that met out in the woods at night and called themselves druids, and had very high-minded discussion and drank a lot of ishkabach, a lot of the waters of life, a lot of whiskey. Just sort of fancy lad societies. Not but if we're to believe their charters or whatever, they're the ancient orders of druids, and we're the builders of Stonehenge. No, you're not. The druids used it, but they didn't build it.
Interesting.
Oh yeah. And it's a constant. There's a constant sort of back and forth between the Reconstructionist elements in the pagan scene, who want to try to get to the authentic practices of the old time, and the people who want to adapt, and the more neo-pagan elements as well. So that's what a lot of people see as sort of the major split. And most people tend to come down somewhere in that continuum.
It makes me think too, like, where people take specific groups and look at their actions and use them to paint the rest of the group. And for Christians, I'm sure everybody knows the group that gets pointed at to make it seem like all Christians are like that, or the right-wing evangelicals, or like the smallest one being Westboro Baptist Church, and just pointing to what they're doing and saying and being like, that's Christianity. And a lot of what I do is trying to show people there's all this room within Christianity, and that's just a little corner of Christianity. And even a lot of right-wing evangelicalism, the way they say things and their theology and beliefs are kind of new or very new in the history of Christianity. But what are some of the groups in your case that people point to as that's what pagans are that isn't?
Well, I mean, you've got the church burners, obviously the Norwegian black metal guys like
Hmm.
Varg, and those types who just uh, literally there's literally like murder, mayhem, church burning.
Hmm.
There is literal cannibalism, literal fascism, and all this. There's also there's sad to say there are right wing pagan groups as well. Heaven knows there's and even not just pagans per se, but groups like the Soldiers of Odin in Scandinavia, and sad to say here in the U.S. too, who are just these anti-immigration groups that use Odin Allfather as a not very not very well made dog whistle, like a dog whistle made on the Friday shift.
Hmm.
But yeah,
Yeah, I never heard of
so you've
these
got
people.
that. You've got, and then basically your storybook witches as well. Um, I think that there's room for the storybook witch, uh, because the older you go, and sort of the more obscure you go, they have this they have this wonderful complexity to them. So yeah, they will sometimes still eat kids, but they'll also sometimes help kids, like the way that uh, Baba Yaga, as we Yanks like to say, the witch of Russian folk and fairy tales, who lives on her hut on chicken feet in the woods. She'll sometimes eat people, but then again, she also is there dispensing magical trinkets and things to righteous uh, protagonists in some stories as well. And it's I think there's likewise a lot of room for this for a much larger conversation as far as what paganism could be in the future, and has the potential to be.
Hmm.
There's some really wonderful folks. Um, there's Heathens Against Hate, which is specifically Norse pagan Asatru. Um, so they're fighting back against the fascistic and white nationalistic elements in that community, which is an ongoing problem. Gosh, there's some really wonderful work, and I think paganism has a reputation as a haven for weirdos, and we've kind of earned that. And you take the good with the bad in that case, and you try to protect the good from the bad as
Hmm.
well.
I like it.
Thanks.
Yeah. I've been yeah, it's interesting how it's yeah, I don't know. How people tell stories about other groups in order to fearmonger. And so it's and we were talking a little bit too, like when we are messaging each other, how the when by making videos like in the leftist space, we have people who come in and feel like talk like project those bad stories onto people like us just by seeing like me use the word Christian or you use the word pagan. And actually when I first started, well, my YouTube channel first was like kind of a general progressive Christianity, which is just socially progressive Christianity. And then I guess toward the end of last year, I moved to leftist, like specifically to talk about anti-capitalist as well, Christianity. And I was into BreadTube, and I was watching a lot of BreadTube videos, and I was on the subreddit and looking at all that. But I felt like I couldn't post my videos there because I didn't know how they felt about Christians like me. I didn't know if they're just going to immediately start responding with, hey, like you can't be a Christian and a leftist, or like Marxism is inherently against religious people. And so I was scared. And then someone else posted my video in there saying it was a video about Rosa Luxemburg talking about socialism in the churches, and
Oh
so
wow.
it was so I did a video series talking about that essay, and so somebody posted my video in the subreddit and said, I figured y'all need some more Rosa Luxemburg and Jesus, and then people were commenting positively. I'm like, what? And then I
Oh
commented
yeah.
like, hey, that's me. And I was actually afraid of posting here because I know how y'all felt about Jesus, and they're like, we're totally cool with it. And then so then I like slowly started posting my stuff, and I got mostly people positive comments. It's like what's been interesting to
Great
see is
surprise.
yeah, it's interesting to see like people who grew up Christian and or evangelical and then left and are like now hearing this stuff being talked about in a healthy way for the first time, and that's what they're enjoying. And then there's people who have always been not involved in religion or whatever, and just still like the way that I talk about leftist stuff, and they like the different angle. And so usually with non-religious people like responding to my stuff or commenting on stuff, that's usually where they're coming from, where they'll like, I've gotten multiple comments where they'll say, hey, I'm an atheist, but you're doing God's work here, like kind of half jokingly.
I love
And
that.
yeah, and then they but then once in a while I will get people who uh don't like that I'm a Christian in this space. Like I remember there's a subreddit. I was posting in different leftist subreddits, and there's one called Left Without Edge. It's supposed to be the subreddit that's like, we talk about leftism, but we're nice and we're kind and we treat each other with respect. And I posted my video in there, and somebody commented saying, get this fairy tale bullshit out of here. So like, wait, what?
Somebody didn't read the name of the subreddit very well.
Yeah, exactly. So
Gosh.
once in a while I get that. Have you gotten like non-religious or atheists or non-pagan people respond negatively?
I have not. I have not gotten that much of.
Well, Christians have hurt more
Every now
people than
and then,
pagans, so maybe that's why.
yeah. Well, yeah. It's more of, with me. There was just this one commenter so far who was like, "Oh, rituals brought to you courtesy of." So there's this one video where I've include a ritual, and it's like, "Oh, rituals courtesy of Hammer horror films from the '70s," and I'm like, "Screw you, buddy! I actually wrote that myself." But
Oh,
you
wow.
know,
That's interesting.
it's it's whatever. It's pathetic.
Yeah.
And hey, I'm working with limited supplies, with limited budget and time. So, B grade horror movies are, the comparison's gonna come up. I might as well make peace with it.
Mm-hmm. It's
And
interesting.
I'm working with subject matter that most people consider wookie spooky. So, I'm surprised it didn't come up sooner.
Mm. Have you gotten pagans kind of respond negatively on YouTube or in real life for you being leftist and like, that's not pagan?
I have. There's very rarely, like, the you get the odd person who feels very strongly about certain traditions and considers themselves a strong traditionalist, or was raised exceedingly capitalist, exceedingly liberal, and gets really into that sort of thing. You sometimes also get people, especially on the Satanist side of things, or the left-hand path, what's called the left-hand path, where you have people who are strong believers in meritocracy and in might makes right. Most of Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible is cribbed directly from the book Might Makes Right, which
Oh,
is
wow. I didn't know that.
which is this. It's like proto objectivism, proto Ayn Rand, and there's there's a strain of why are you bringing in this political thing to this spiritual thing? But, my feeling is that, they complete one another, as with so many things. And, you're not going to attain spiritually if you're not, if you're not staying alive. You can't talk about a dignified life before you're talking about just life. So, politics keep me alive, spirituality to remind me of what's worth living for.
Ooh, I like that. That's good.
Like, and I think in the New Age, in the New Age world, there are a lot of people who get into like the secret, and that sort of thing, where you're just thinking about things. In in the words of the coup, I'm anti-upping your dollars with telekinesis. Done tried every day, and that shit decreases. So they believe in success just by thinking, and it's anti. It is spiritual in a sense, but I think both Jesus and our pagan ancestors as well would realize that you can't ask somebody to forgive their neighbor on an empty belly. The feeding of the 500 and so forth. You can't, and in the same way, you can't ask people to you can't ask people to just concentrate on the hereafter or on the summerlands. You've got to have you've got to have something grounded in the here and now.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you.
That's I like that. And what's funny too, in my being more open to different religions compared to when I was growing up, I've come to also realize that there's certain versions of religion and spirituality that I am now against or dislike or prefer not to interact with, but it's for different reasons now. Where growing up, the reason was because that's demonic or that's evil. And now I know it's not, but now it's for practical reasons. Like, for example, the Satanic Bible, how you said it's inspired by fascism and Ayn Rand and stuff like that. How it's before I would be against the Satanic Bible because it has the word Satan in it. And it's you're opening up the door for demonic influence. But now I would be against the Satanic Bible for the practical reasons that it's inspired by might makes right. And so I've found that interesting.
It's an interesting scene, and I've definitely, I've met Satanists that I get along with, and I've met Satanists that I don't get along with. And it's interesting because the sine qua non of the ones I get along with is, do they accept capitalism or do they reject it? The ones that it's, and it's the ones that. I wanted to put this up because I'm like, what's gonna scare away the fascists more than just smears of paint with no representation whatsoever.
Yeah,
but it's just
it's all good.
I'll actually put it up next time.
Okay. Yeah. I also know Dead Man Animations is an anti-capitalist Satanist, but that's the first one I've found or heard of. Yeah.
I've met a fair few, and it's very much in line with sort of the egoist communist school of thought, the Stirnerite, the ego and its own, which is, if you're gonna rank individualist authors, he's right up top. Up top. But yeah, there's I'm sorry, I completely the thread of the conversation got completely lost in the in
All
the
good.
shifting painting. Boy,
Yeah.
I'm a
Another,
perfectionist.
yeah, another thing too that like I grew up seeing wrong for different reasons is like the new age secret type stuff where it's like I grew up being told like that's that's worshiping yourself, that's expecting it to come out from things other than God or whatever. And now it's like I find it harmful because it ignores a lot of real suffering. And
Mhm.
so it's, yeah, it's been interesting, that transition to have like better reasons to be against certain things and reasons to not be against things that I grew up being against.
Oh yeah, it's amazing what a bit of perspective will do.
Hmm.
I used to be absolutely open to the secret and that sort of thing, um, until I started, taking a more critical look at it. Part of what really opened me up. There's this author that I love called Barbara Ehrenreich, and she's
Okay.
written some amazing stuff. I think you would really enjoy her work, Dancing in the Streets, which is all about collective celebration and just sort of the history of parties in the West, and because her idea was, oh well, the Western anthropologists go to these other cultures and they see people dancing in the streets and they say, oh, how exotic, and they write down everything in their little notebooks,
Hmm.
and they forget, when they go back home to England or whatever, and they see Christmas carolers, or they see, or they go back home to France or Spain and they see, Mardi Gras or Carnival happening, and they're like, oh, that's just dirty peasant superstition, whatever. And the and so check out Dancing in the Streets for sure. I brought up Barbara Ehrenreich to talk about this other thing that she did called Smile or Die. And
Okay.
there's a talk that she did at the Royal Society called Smile or Die, and she talks about the author of The Secret, Rhonda Byrne, and so the main idea of The Secret, for anybody who doesn't know, is it's called the law of attraction. The idea being that you cultivate thoughts about whatever you want. You want a brand new Cadillac, you just think day in, day out, brand new Cadillac, brand new Cadillac, brand new Cadillac, and it appears, and you manifest it. You take it out of thin air, as it were. And if you're experiencing bad things, here's the dark side of the law of attraction. If you're
Yeah.
experiencing bad things, if your kids have been taken away, or if your services have gotten cut off, or if you're in the poorhouse, that's because you were thinking about it and you attracted it to you like a magnet. And so you have this excuse to just sweep every bit of systemic evil under the rug. And apparently, and she says this in the talk, she references a press event where Rhonda Byrne was being talked about, the big tsunami in the early aughts in the South Seas that devastated Indonesia and India. She said that the people who had been killed and otherwise, their lives completely wrecked by this tsunami, had been sending out tsunami-like vibrations into the universe.
Hmm.
And I'm just like, that cured me of every bit of susceptibility to that particular New Age graft.
Mhm.
Others, well, I take it case by case, but
Yeah.
but yeah, that cured me really quick. I need to be living in a universe where not everything is my fault.
Mm. I feel that.
Interestingly, I mentioned the Order of the Golden Dawn earlier. There's a rank in this fancy lad society, and fancy lady society. It should be said they were kind of woke on that score, but there's this one rank where your mission statement is to to consider everything that happens to you as a direct communication of God with your soul. And I think I could probably handle that for about an hour at a stretch. But apparently, if I think Adeptus Major is if you're an Adeptus Major, that's how you go through your days. Oh, yeah. The law of attraction is prosperity gospel for woo people. Snaps for that. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Yep.
So that's so I kind of talk about that. Say that again.
You'll have these woo people who absolutely, they will look at the prosperity gospel and go, "Oh, if they only knew." And I'm just sitting there like
Yeah, and I see it from the other side of Christians looking at people like the woo people and like if they only knew, or they're being deceived, or they're never going to get what they want. But if they had Jesus, then they would get everything that they want. And it's also ridiculous. And so it's funny with I grew up around a lot of Christians who acted just like fans of The Secret, who were what they would say, name it and claim it. You just name it for God to hear, claim that it's already yours, and God will acknowledge that and give it to you. And and there's this constant, like, you have to make sure you do ask for things that you want. You have to ask God. And I had a pastor once that said that I think he had a dream or something, or he just had a thought that of imagining himself going to heaven and Jesus telling him, "You could have had all these things. I would have given them to you, but you didn't ask for it." And that like inspired him to like constantly ask for everything. And it was interesting because it was within the spirit of like name it and claim it still, where it's like you have to say all these things, and if you don't, then the good won't come to you, or the good will be held back from you. And I ultimately felt like a lot of that talk could be very harmful, especially when like the negative side, saying that people deserved it, or people weren't close to God, or there's sin in their life. I heard that a lot, where it's like you're praying for God to make you better and it's not working. It's probably because you have a sin in your life that you haven't given up yet. And it's like, it's awful. And it's really bad.
And what happened to judge not lest? Like that, it's and oh my gosh, that's really wild. But one thing I've discovered is that people will snob about anything given half a chance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also feel like when I read the Bible and the Old Testament and New Testament, there is kind of a discouragement from making those kinds of connections of like larger meaning making just for the sake of it. Where like I see in the book of Job, where Job suffering befalls him and he loses everything and he's crying out to God, "Why would you do this?" And all of his friends around him, they surround him and tell him, "I'll tell you why this is happening. It's happening because you have a certain sin in your life," or "I'll tell you it's happening because God is testing you," or "I'll tell you it's happening because you're sinning but you don't know that you're sinning." And then at the end, it ends with God making an appearance saying, "You're all wrong, and let me point to you to all the chaotic creation of the universe," and continuously ask, "Were you there when I created this? Were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did that?" And that's how it ends. And Job is like, "I see God now." There's no ultimate like this was the reason why. He just points them to the chaos. And then I see in the New Testament with Jesus, they're constantly asking him those kinds of questions where they see a blind guy and they ask Jesus, "Is he blind because he sinned or because his parents sinned?" And Jesus says, "Neither. Now let's go heal him." And another scene, exactly. And another scene where they're like, "We heard the story of a pillar and by this temple fell on some people. What did they do wrong for that to happen?" And he said, "Nothing." Or he says, he says something like that, like nothing, but if you don't repent, then you will perish. And so it's like, it's, for me, the spirit of, in the narrative of the Bible is discouraging and condemning people who say that happened because of this and I know it, and assigning these metaphysical meanings on things.
No, yeah, it's really that makes a lot of sense, especially, especially because, you've got this you've got this element of mystery. I think it's very, very tempting to try to make the world make complete sense, and I think that's part of the appeal of a certain type of leftism as well, where people think they've got everything. They've got the immortal science and they've got it all figured out, and shut up, Anarchitty, you'll get it in the end. And it's the same,
Yeah.
it's the same attitude of the people who, who have their cosmology all figured out, and don't, and don't want to hear anything that's gonna shake them out of that assuredness. Can really, thank you, Alana Montero in the chat over here. It can really hurt disadvantaged people, disabled people, because there's also the judgment that you're spiritually inferior, don't have enough faith, don't love God enough. I can imagine that getting right under people's skin.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, Faith coming in with, yeah, my old church told me that if I don't give my queerness up, then I obviously don't love Jesus. Whoo! Mercy. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me too, actually, of like, I grew up in a church that was against LGBTQ people. You're reading the Avenger quote?
Immortal Science sounds like the worst.
That's true. That's very true.
Oh my gosh. Oh boy.
Immortal Science. And so growing up, it's like, I think I just took it for granted and didn't have to think about it. And I have friends that were gay or bi or trans. And then as I got older, I started to meet them, and therefore had to actually think about it. And and then I studied a lot of what other people say about the interpretation of scripture, and realized, like, the 5 or 6 verses that people use, they call them clobber passages because people use them to clobber over people over the head, and that those verses aren't talking about what we now know today as gay relationships and trans people.
Yes. Oh,
yeah, so,
King James, you were a weird one.
Who?
King James.
Oh, King James.
Yeah, James the First of England and the 6th of Scotland translated the Bible. He created the King James version, and people accept it because it was made by a king. Again, weird authoritarianism. You've got people who claim to be real lovers of liberty, and yet why do you like the King James version so much? Because it was made by a king. My daddy was special. I get to rule everybody. Oh boy.
And even like the word homosexual wasn't put in the Bible until like the 1950s, and it wasn't coined until like the late 1800s, the word. And so it's like, and even though when that word does get mentioned in 1 Timothy and 1 Corinthians, it's referring specifically to men who had slave boys that they would have sex with. And Paul is saying those people will not make it into the kingdom of heaven. And so
I wonder why.
Exactly.
Yeah. And can I tell you about one of my favorite clobber passages and the mistranslation there?
Yeah.
So, of course, one of the ones that one of the clobber passages that has has cost many innocent lives over the time, including in the reign of King James. One of the reasons he made his translation was because he was absolutely mad about witches. And during King James's reign, there was this huge witch panic, which, and, the sons and daughters of the people who survived that panic were, came over here and did the same thing over again. So King James Bible says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," of course. But the Hebrew is a word meaning poisoner.
I haven't looked into that before.
Yeah, apparently that's what it is. So, and you can imagine, you can imagine there's not really a single English word that sums up poisoner aside from poisoner.
Yeah.
Of course. But then again, who knows exactly what was on James's mind? I think I do. He wanted to purge the land of witches. No, yeah. Stay mad, James. You do you, boo-boo. But again, without that unaccountable authority, you would have a dude with a weird bee in his bonnet about witches versus a dude with an army and a state at his disposal with a weird bee in his bonnet about witches.
Yeah, it's interesting. And
it's also interesting because that was the early modern period, so you're just starting to get the professionalization of medicine, so you're starting to get into things that Silvia Federici was talking about in Caliban and the Witch, which is an absolute banger if you're looking for texts that bring together not necessarily paganism, but certainly witchcraft and the left. So it's a work of feminist sort of history, and as well as there's literature stuff in there as well. It's excellent. Go check it out, Caliban and the Witch.
Yeah. And it's interesting how people are simply just taking, this is how we understand this word or this relationship or this type of person today, so therefore they meant that back then, right? This exact type of person. And I think with the verses that seem to be against gay people, it seems to be, it's there was a total different understanding even back then of those relationships. And so it's even Paul writing about it could not grasp at all what a gay couple walking down the street looks like today at all. You cannot imagine that. And so it's interesting, and that has been really helpful for me to have that transition, and because now I get to be blessed by reading tons of queer theologians. Queer theology has been extremely helpful for me, and stretching everything so much wider.
I actually, queer theology is queer Christian theology is something that I haven't encountered terribly much, but I do move in a few Unitarian circles. There's a really wonderful Unitarian community out here. They've actually had me in to preach a couple of times at as a guest minister, and it's a lovely community. And Philosophy Tube did do a video about Caliban and the Witch, and somebody made a suggestion for response videos that I really like. Instead of just knocking out different points and responding to videos that we disagree with entirely, this person was like, what if we yes-anded these videos? I want to yes-and that Philosophy Tube video because he goes into some depth about the sorry. Sometimes words, they do that thing.
Because you're passionate about it. We feel it. We feel your passion.
And everybody rushes in.
Yeah.
And they're just jammed in there all together.
Yeah.
So
It's a blessing to be
I wanna
that
go in there
passionate
and
about
yes
something.
and that video.
Yeah.
That's all I wanted to say. But
Yeah. I did that a long time ago, or a few months ago, with a Gushin video. It was when Gushin had like way under 1,000 subscribers, and I just really liked her videos. And she did a video on centrism or being apolitical. That's what, yeah, being apolitical, and how that really is a right-wing position because you're affirming the status quo by saying I don't involve myself in politics. And I love the video, and I made
I wash my hands of this.
yeah, so I made like a yes and video by saying, here's how Christians do the same thing. And I just made a whole video about how Christians say they're apolitical and why that's wrong. And so that was pretty cool. And that's actually, I feel like doing that is part of what got my channel some attention in the beginning, because like shortly after that, she made a video of like, here's some leftist YouTubers to follow. And I was the first one because I think I made that video. So that was cool.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And thank you, Bubble Boy, offering PDFs of your referencing Caliban and the Witch, I'm assuming. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, faith is a Unitarian Universalist. I love Unitarian Universalists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely.
Pretty righteous community. The what was I gonna? I forget what I was going to say.
It's interesting. I actually took some weird spiritual belief quiz on BeliefNet to say like, what religion should you really be? And at the end it said Unitarian Universalist, even though I felt like I answered all the questions based on my faith in Jesus. It was like, no, this is what you are. I was like, whatever.
It's yeah, those quizzes are silly anyway.
Yeah.
You know, they're always going to be limited by whatever the quiz maker is.
Yeah. Actually, I'll say this, that attending that church, a local Unitarian Universalist church, was what like helped me give up the idea of a literal hell that people get sent to forever and ever, because I was already like intellectually starting to stop believing in it and seeing like different interpretations of scripture, and how even there is misinterpretations of like clobber passages, and how even if you look at the character of God throughout the biblical narrative, is a God that only punishes to restore and reconcile. So there's tons of reasons to not believe that interpretation, that there's a literal eternal hell. But through that studying, that's how I happened upon Unitarian Universalist Church. And I was just watching a lot of videos of them and being really surprised. Like, I've never heard people talk like this about religion. And then I went to the church, and like the first person I had a conversation with was a trans woman who was like really nice and awesome. And I then sat down and they're like saying the prayers. And I remember looking around at this big room of all these Unitarian Universalists thinking, according to some people, every single person in this room is going to hell. And I cannot buy into that because like these people are awesome and faithful and passionate about justice and loving people and helping people. And I have officially given that up now.
Righteous. Oh, I love that.
But what's up, Camazotz?
Hey, Camazotz!
People are coming in. Yeah.
So Damon, I was thinking about stuff to talk about, and one of the things that's always impressed me about Christianity and its intersection with leftism is this part of the Book of Acts where they're talking about the early church, basically. And here I am, I was one of these people who was like, I was born in the wrong generation,
Yeah.
in middle and high school. I was that cringy neo-hippie kid. But, I couldn't help but think, this sounds like a commune, and they had all their things in common, and they were healing people and giving to the poor. So in your experience with the Pentecostal and evangelical traditions, did they have any kind? Do they address that at all?
Well, it's I think how it's Rosa Luxemburg did an essay called Socialism and the Churches, which I think is probably a pretty good resource on that, because she was leading these mass worker strikes and the local preachers were preaching against them. And she, as a Jewish atheist, was thinking, I know some Christian history and you all should be the first ones to be on board with this if you follow Jesus. And so she wrote that whole essay to basically argue that. And she starts with the Church of Acts and then goes throughout church history. But I like how she points out how everyone shared everything in common, and that was already a huge deal because it created an alternative lifestyle and an alternative community to where you no longer had to depend on the Roman government. You were able to depend on this community of people that shared everything, and people would sell everything they had and then bring the money to the leaders of the community, and then they would share that. And if somebody needed something, they would just ask around the community and say, here you go. Also, they had meals, common meals. That's what communion initially was. The Lord's Supper wasn't just a little flake of bread and some wine. It was an actual meal. And even 1 Corinthians, where Paul is giving instructions for how to do the supper, he specifically says, people who have enough to eat, make sure that you don't eat like make sure you let the people who don't have enough to eat first. That is the proper order of this ritual of the Lord's Supper. And so there's that. And even a part of the Lord's Supper, they would also go around and make sure that everyone was taken care of. Everyone had a place to stay. Everyone's hospital bills were paid. Everyone had debts was taken care of. And so that was the community. But the thing is, socialism or communism is a sharing of the wealth and the work. And so the early church technically wasn't full communism because they didn't share the work. So they had these Roman centurion leaders and tax collectors and slaves, all a part of the same community, sharing what they have, but it was still that what they had was still being made through exploitation of lower classes. And so I think it's possible they could have reached that point where they also got to that point where sharing the work and even change the economic system. But it was hard to do that when it was illegal to be Christian in these meetings and they're being executed for it. And so I think it being stamped out because it was illegal made it difficult to reach that point, and then eventually ended up just being the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it shifted to where people got really comfortable with that, happy that they're not being executed anymore. And then, but actually when it did become the religion of the empire under Constantine, a group of people led by Saint Benedict of Nursia went into the desert and started. That's where we get our monastic monks communities. That's the origin of that, is the order of Saint Benedict.
Yeah.
So he took people out into the desert because he felt like, well, the church now is something different, because now people were going to church just to impress the Roman emperor, not because they're actually passionate about the life of Jesus. And so he went to the desert, and his group that he started was committed to prayer and work. And so I think that community was like a commune once again. And even today, monastic communities run like communes. And so it's that commune aspect has continued, but now just through monastic communities.
So the monastic tradition, more than the Church of Acts, is, well,
the Church of Acts was, and then when it became, the Church of Acts was, and then when it became the religion of the empire,
they're the ones that share the production and enjoyment of the necessities, comforts, and refinements of life.
Yeah.
I really, I wanted to,
by the way, I think it was St. John Chrysostom who suggested people, might have been Rosa. I think Rosa Luxemburg was agreeing with John Chrysostom, but I think it came from him first, saying that people should try out living in monastic communities so that they know what it's like to live just based on the necessities. And then that can put you in a heart place and mindset where you're no longer feeling like, well, we don't have enough resources for everyone, because a lot of anti-socialists or anti-leftists are people who are constantly fearful that we don't have enough for everyone because they haven't actually lived a life where they're just living based on the necessities.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, there's a pagan Stoic philosopher called Marcus Aurelius who would who advocated, like, every so often, just put on your raggediest cloak, sleep on a bare floor, eat some bread crusts, drink some water, and remind yourself of how little you actually need to keep the motor turning over. And it's interesting to me. Yeah, people are so worried that there's not enough, because they can't imagine, they can't imagine 7.5 billion people living a suburban lifestyle.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
American lifestyle. And I wanted to quickly address what Alana was saying. The thing that puts me off Unitarian Universalism is that in my city, at least, it seems to be mostly upper middle class Anglos, and I feel unwelcome. Same with Quakers. And I went to school in Western Mass, and there's what they call the there's like an invisible barrier. I bet it's probably redlined all to hell, is why it seems that way. But they call it like the tofu wall. So you get north of this one point on 91, and suddenly it's middle class Anglo-American people, and then you go south of that, and it's and everything's much more diverse and much lower working class, and it's a problem, because there's a big concern in Unitarian Universalism for social justice and economic justice, and even if a lot of folks are stopping at liberalism and just sort of peeking over the edge at the rest of us. Hi, come on in, the water's fine. That's what I say to them. But yeah, and I think hopefully. Oh, I didn't know that they were. I didn't know they had that much autonomy. That's kind of cool. According to Faith UUs do have a central organization, but each congregation operates independently. So yeah, it's cool that there's some there's freedom there to sort of address those problems.
Yeah. Also, even within Christianity, the progressive churches would usually just be in the mainline Protestant churches, like Episcopal churches, Disciples of Christ, ELCA, which is like the progressive wing of Lutherans, United Church of Christ, and certain Methodists. And even those tend to also be mostly old white people when you go to those churches. And it's funny because you wouldn't think that, like, okay, the churches that actually ordain gay and trans people, that are passionate about social justice, let's see what this community looks like. And you see a bunch of old boomers, the white boomers, that it's like, wait, what? This isn't what I thought it was. I thought it was gonna be a bunch of young people. But the reason is, there's a few reasons, but part of it, first of all, is that they don't have an attractional model like evangelical churches do, who are constantly putting on outreaches and constantly trying to get people to come to church. They don't really care. They're fine. Whoever comes. And so they're not actively doing a lot of outreaches usually. And a lot of the progressive Christian churches don't really have that much of a social media presence, because it's mostly old people. And so people don't even know that they're in their city because they don't have a social media presence. And the other thing, I think, is there are a lot of white people end up turning to a progressive spirituality because from a privileged point in life, you have more time to actually study this stuff out and learn more progressive spirituality, because it can take a lot of time and energy to actually study this stuff out, to learn about progressive versions of Christianity and other spiritualities. And people of color who are Christians, there's a lot of Black churches and Mexican churches who are very traditional and conservative. And I think it's because, and if you ask them about progressive Christianity, they usually have never heard of any of that. And it's partly because it's like they even are Christian because it was colonized in their culture, and so their theology is still colonized. But a lot of them don't have the time and energy to put in to actually learn of other versions, more progressive versions of spirituality. And so I think part of getting these progressive religious spaces to be filled with more people of color we need socialism and justice for the poor in order for them to learn more progressive stuff, more progressive spirituality.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. No, I love that. There's there's a very similar thing in the pagan scene where there's a lot of showy a lot of the very public facing congregations in Wicca and that sort of thing. There'll be a certain demographic that goes to that, and it's sometimes hard to find groups that with a more Reconstructionist bent, because it's just little groups of friends somewhere. And I think though that the Reconstructionist side has some very important stuff as far as spirituality that you can do while working a 9-to-5 or more, and stuff that you can fit into a busy lifestyle, and where you don't feel that you have to have 2-hour rituals just for a full moon, or you don't have to have a wardrobe full of robes, or a closet full of crystals and in fancy little things and holders. And there's a lot of spiritual materialism out there, whatever your path is, and it's very silly on the one hand, but it's easy to see why people go in for it, because you just look so cool. Everybody loves the aesthetic, or everybody loves some aesthetic. So one thing that I had wanted to ask you about was, what are some of the aspects of your faith that you want to reclaim from the reactionaries and the bullshitters and all the rest of it?
I think what it means to actually love people. It's like Christians are all about, we love everybody because Jesus loved everybody. And yet they have all these conditions on that, where it's at times where it's like, but unless they came over here illegally, or if they're gay, or if they've broken the law, or if whatever. And it's like, Jesus didn't have these conditions when he actually loves people. And so I think reclaiming the fact that Jesus was radically for the marginalized of society. And even there's multiple stories in the Gospels of Jesus. It starts out with a person who is being overlooked by society. Maybe it's a beggar, or a disabled person, or a prostitute. And it starts out with, these people walked by, that person walked by, that person walked by, or that person saw them as something. And then Jesus stopped and saw them. He was able to see people in a way that called everyone else's attention to them. And he helped them. And so or even like reframing who they are for people, like a prostitute washing Jesus' feet with her hair, and a Pharisee says, "Oh, if he knew what kind of woman this woman actually was, then he wouldn't be letting her do that." And then he responds by saying, "Do you see this woman? Like, do you see her? The fact that you just see her as just a prostitute means you don't actually see this person, as a woman." And so I think, yeah, and so it's like I want to be able to, and I very much am inspired by that still, where I'm able to see everyone as someone made in the image of God and worthy of love, and very much want to help other people see them for who they actually are as well. And I am very passionate about, and it's funny that ends up putting me in a position in like a leftist YouTube space where I'm more able to forgive people for mistakes that they've made. And it's funny, I feel like some people would assume the Christian would be more on the side of like canceling people, but I'm usually on the other side sometimes with the dirtbag leftists, because I'm like, well, I follow Jesus, and Jesus loves dirtbags too. And so I
Yeah, I feel that.
it's yeah, and so it's interesting. And then I but at the same time, I still very much want to bring the way we use language, caring for marginalized people as well. But I so that love element and actually caring for people and actually helping people, I want to reclaim. And I like what Martin Luther King Jr. said about the Samaritan, where it's like the Good Samaritan parable is a person beaten on the road, and a rich person passes by, a priest passes by, other people pass by, but the Samaritan stops and helps them and gives them aid. And that's and people love that story, like, yeah, be a good Samaritan, help people that are beaten on the side of the road. But Martin Luther King Jr. said we have to change the system so that we no longer have people beaten on the side of the road that need help. So it's like that's really what I'm about too, where it's like, yes, help people, but let's change the system so that we can help people. And or I like Pope Francis has said, in the same way we say thou shalt not kill, we should also say thou shalt not to systems that kill, and talking about capitalism. And so I feel that too. So it's like me coming to leftist politics was purely through the path of Jesus and through the path of liberation theology in particular, that was able to call people's attention to the voices of the marginalized and center them in the whole story. So
Beautiful thing. The Good Samaritan is also a wonderful bit of like proto-internationalism, because of course one of the bits of context that always gets lost these days is that Judea and Samaria were bitter rivals at the time, and the other characters in the story were Judeans, and so they were his neighbors in terms of like local politics. And this guy from the out group, who doesn't have any responsibility in terms of that society for this person. So not just doing well for somebody who is not just doing well for somebody who's in your in group, but also learning to see beyond the in group. And I think that world religions, as opposed to tribal religions, have a real advantage there, because and Muhammad and the early Ummah, the early Islamic community, was much like this too, where you have all these intertribal rivalries going on, and you have this charismatic leader coming in and saying, no more of that, thank you. We're one thing now. We're this other thing. We're on some new shit, and you're gonna get with the program. And as much as I love a good tribal religion, They do. There is a tendency for the in-group, out-group monkey mind to, yeah. Oh, Alana coming in the chat with a little snippet of gold, a little real nugget there. Changing unjust systems is love.
Yeah. Yeah. I even like realized recently in the way that Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, and that's like the constant theme of going around preaching, talking about the kingdom of God. To me, talking about the kingdom of God is a way that Jesus was making the issues systemic, where people would be talking about individuals constantly of like, well, did that person sin, or is that person wrong, or should that person deserve that thing, being individualistic about it. And he was like, well, let's talk about the kingdom of God, which is very much like this whole thing needs to be changed through the system, not through just get that individual out of here and make that individual change and do that to that individual. And it's by constantly talking about the kingdom of God and teaching this prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. To me, it's like to be a Christian is to be working together to change the world and the system in a way that runs as if the God of love and justice were running it. And that seems to be what like the kingdom of God talk really is about.
I love it. I love it. I actually had a dream back when I was still considering myself monotheist. I had a dream that my very secular family had gotten together because the kingdom of God had arrived. That basically everything was good now. And we were all partying in the backyard of this, typical American suburban house. And one of my cousins was working at what looked like a pottery wheel, but there were these glass or crystal figures on it. And he was turning this one column of glass on this wheel, and he was turning it like a lathe. So he had a chisel in the one hand, and was running it over this column of glass. And so these shards of glass were magically spinning off in all directions and coming down to rest at the sides of this pottery wheel type device he was using. And they were forming themselves into these delicate little sculptures all around. And I remember thinking that his work, the thing that he was actually doing, the thing that, that his hands were forming was kind of rough and rugged, I couldn't quite see what he was going for. But all these little figures around the edge that were made of the shards coming off were perfect. And I just remember thinking that, in the kingdom of God, or in a more in an accountable system, you're not just going to have righteous action. You're not just going to have, somebody doing a thing, but not just our actions, but all the knockdown effects of our actions, are going to be improved as well. And, we're going to be able to intercede for good at the source. And of course, that's the whole goal of our politics, is, interceding for good at the source instead of going around and, sticking Band-Aids on things. I know what the painting is.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, and it very much seems like people who believe that the world is sacred and everything and everyone in it should be the first ones to care about making it a better place. And so it's interesting that we have to like convince some of our fellow spiritual minded people to actually care about politics and stuff.
Well, yeah, it's it's one of those things where I, I actually, as far as role models for organizing, I can hardly think of a better one than Jesus in many ways, because like you say, he was right there among the marginalized and getting them to think in this new way, not just not necessarily above or beyond the pedestrian concerns of the day, but showing them how these systemic concerns play into those the everyday soap opera type problems that people might bring to an upstart preacher, and there's not much of that that's comparable in the pagan sphere that I'm aware of, but I find that there's a lot of possibility for that sort of thing, and there's a lot of people that are dissatisfied with things, and you should go paint a thing then, Faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's interesting how Jesus is able to transcend all these religious boundaries. Most religions have some sort of honor for Jesus, whether he's a great teacher, a prophet, or divine. It's even all the OG atheist philosophers, not the new atheists. The OG atheists usually had the opinion Jesus was great. The Christians are the ones that have a problem with. And so it's interesting.
Yeah. And it's you look at a classic like The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists, where they have no love lost for the self-righteous stuffed shirt bourgeois Christians, but they have the typical for the time sort of socialist view that these workers are being led astray by by these churchy types, and there's a wonderful I'm sorry, I got distracted by I got distracted by the question about orgies, but
you do what you want, Kamazat.
No, yeah, absolutely. Like consenting an adult.
Yeah, exactly.
Because people need guidelines sometimes.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, it's there's sort of a sense that these workers are being led astray, and while there definitely are preachers who are doing that then as now, there's definitely for example, all entire traditions like Methodism that were 100 years ago, Methodism was hella radical.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's interesting to me to see how that's changed, and to see where perhaps there's room for a renewal, a revival of that old fire.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in the middle of a huge transition within all religions, and even I know for the Christian tradition, Phyllis Tickle pointed out in her book, The Great Emergence, that the church seems to go through a huge transition and a sort of rummage sale of ideas every 500 years, where you have the birth of Christianity, then about 500 years later, the Constantinian shift of being the official religion of the empire, and then about 500 years later, you had the Eastern Church and the Western Church, the Great Schism. And then about 500 years later, it was the Protestant Reformation. And now we're 500 years later again. And once again, we seem to be going through a similar transition. Islam, too, which is chronologically 500 years behind, going through a sort of reformation. And Buddhism through the first, second, and third, and now fourth turning is what they would call it. And so those are the only ones I know, but I'm sure it's in others, too, where it's very much we are in a. And each of those transitions were preceded by major technological revolutions, where the Protestant Reformation had the printing press that led to that Reformation. And now we have the internet that seems to lead to a huge transition. And so I think 100 years from now, people will be able to dissect this big transition a lot easier. But right now, we're in the middle of it and it's in our face. And so we're just groping in the dark, going along with whatever's happening. And I think this shift will involve leaving behind certain right-wing versions of spirituality and embracing definitely socially progressive spirituality and LGBTQ affirming spirituality. But then, and I'm hoping that it'll also be some economically leftist spirituality will be able to come in as well.
Well, we're going to need it if we want a livable planet.
Yeah, that's
one of the beautiful things I love about paganism is the relationship with the earth. Just for anybody who's curious, one of the few things that I do every day is I make a sacrifice of the first sip of coffee of the day. It goes on into a little jar on my altar for the ancestors and the spirits of the land and the shades of the dead who are important to me. And also that involves gardening. It involves making sure that I'm improving the soil and doing the compost thing. And there's all sorts of practicalities that also have spiritual reflections. And I think that that's something that anybody, any tradition can expand upon. Is there's a level where you're making time for your faith. Either you've just come into it, or you're trying to reaffirm it, and so you carve out a little bit of your mundane time and you say, this is going to be for prayer, this is going to be for ritual, this is going to be for what have you, meditation or yoga. And I find that the more I integrate these values into my daily existence and not just compartmentalize, the more I'm able to draw branches to my creative work, to my political work, to my mundane work, and Gamazats groping in the dark. Oh lordy. But yeah, it's and it's interesting because I worship primarily the insular Celtic deities, and my fiance, who's in the other room right now, and letting me have this room very sweetly. Thank you, honey. My fiance worships the Greco-Roman pantheon, and so we've got a little we've got his and theirs altars, if you like. But there's nothing in the way of rivalry, as it were. I think, because let's face it, Caesar's conquests and all that, those were a long time ago. And, there's also, I have this intuition that the spirits get along better than we do, and I think that's probably because, as spiritual beings, they don't have to compete for their sustenance.
Yeah.
And as soon as we realize that neither do we, we're going to live in peace like they do. And and of course, they don't have the CIA screwing things up for them. At least I hope they don't. Oh boy.
Yeah. So, yeah, Alana wrote an essay on Methodism and John Wesley. And also the Christians who are climate change deniers. Yeah, that's like weird propaganda. It's the religious right is the moral majority is responsible for that, to where it's like if there's an interesting to notice how different evangelicals were before the moral majority in the 70s and 80s stuff. How before that it was, you couldn't they were largely apolitical, and they were diverse on a lot of their politics. And there's also a lot of evangelicals that were pro-choice, and it was it wasn't, you couldn't look at a group of evangelicals and guess their political views like you can today. And and it was the late 70s. A Republican activist named Paul Weyrich saw the growing evangelical movement and wanted to try to get them to vote for Republicans. And so he started trying out different issues on this group, and a lot of them didn't work. He was just testing them out. And then he found an issue that worked was segregation, because segregation had become illegal, but some private schools were still segregating their schools. One of those was the Christian school, Bob Jones University. And so they wanted to stay segregated. And so he convinced them, hey, vote for these Republicans and they'll keep your schools segregated. And so that was how it first started, but that didn't last very long. And then in the 80s, they had the Roe v. Wade decision. When it happened, evangelicals didn't really care all that much. But then 5 years later, they were trying to find a new issue to mobilize evangelicals, and they're going down the list. And someone was like, how about abortion? And like, okay, we'll try that out. And it worked. And they got all these preachers to speak against abortion 5 years after the decision. And the way that they tell the origin story now was that that's what made them realize, oh my God, Roe v. Wade, we really need to mobilize. But that wasn't the case. And it was
for 5 years.
Exactly. So then they got people like Jerry Falwell Jr. and other people to start speaking about this in the church. And then Ronald Reagan was their puppet that they used to really establish the moral majority and the religious right. And it was interesting to see. But part of what they did was get people to ignore Democrats. Like, to be a Christian is to vote Republican, therefore ignore what the Democrats are pushing. And since the Democrats were the first ones to start pushing certain environmentalist stuff, that became, okay, Christians are against environmentalism because we're against Democrats. And so it was it's all like rooted in that. And then it's propaganda after that just keeps people denying. And now they have just all these weird reasons to justify it, like saying things like God wouldn't do that. God wouldn't let the earth be destroyed through climate change, so therefore it's not going to happen. Or saying Noah, the story of Noah ends with God saying, I will never destroy the earth again. And so when we see a rainbow, that's a reminder that God wouldn't let climate change happen. Or they say that the earth, Jesus is going to come back really soon anyway, like within the next couple of years. So it doesn't matter what's happening to the earth because the rapture is happening super soon. Yeah. And that's a weird newish doctrine too, just from like the last 100 years. The rapture
nowhere
only like 100 years old. It's not in the Bible.
Pure interpretation. I also, it's interesting because with the environmentalism, I've always remembered how it was sort of culturally judo thrown into the cul-de-sac of hippiedom just because it came out of the new left, or it was pushed in the new left circles, and a lot of hippies happen to be environmentalists. So you have these thoroughly researched scientific things like permaculture. Permaculture is a real thing, and people don't know about it because it's in the same cultural ghetto as crystal therapy and Grateful Dead tape exchanges, and it's really too bad because it's what it really amounts to is weaponizing aesthetics to just to keep the dinosaurs of the petrochemical world afloat.
Mm-hmm. Ken also saying, if the revolution happens, do we release the books from the Vatican Library? Yeah, probably. I've never looked into the Vatican Library stuff. I always, like, the little I've seen of it was like heavy conspiracy weirdness, and so I just didn't look further. But I imagine there's just a shitload of boring books in there. That'd be hard.
Imagine, yeah, there's probably some really wild stuff, but I have a feeling there's nothing quite as wild as people are willing to imagine.
Yeah.
I love me some Robert Anton Wilson and the Illuminatus trilogy and other conspiracy stuff. Tom Robbins. Tom Robbins, another roadside attraction, goes into Vatican conspiracy and stuff. Faith, let's see the thing. Let's see the thing you painted, Faith. I don't know if this supports. I don't know if there's a way to get a photo in there, but
I think she could DM me and I could share a screen.
Cool.
But
yeah, no, I don't know. I think the post-Rev Vatican Archives open. Their erotica collection will be fully digitized for consenting connoisseurs of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, also when the
books too. Don't get me wrong. I bet there's probably I bet there's probably some wild stuff. I'm sure there's like Aztec codices and versions of the Gospels that we've never seen, and versions of Ovid, and I bet there's probably classical works that are extant nowhere else.
Mm-hmm.
But there's just too much of that Olympian nonsense to be allowed, or there's too much hanky panky to be allowed, or there's what have you.
Yeah. Why are we trying to storm Area 51? Maybe we should storm the Vatican.
There was a counter meme. During that build up. Oh man, that was such a wonderful demonstration of everything that Peter Coffin talked about in terms of recuperation and attention being basically currency. Did you see the end game where they tried to turn it into just another freaking EDM festival?
Yeah, a little bit.
Oh, I mean,
there's probably nothing there though. If there was aliens there, they moved them.
I mean, if they had them, then I would move them too. I'd say, I would, if I were the government and I had aliens, I would put them anywhere but Area 51.
Yeah, exactly.
Be like, yep, this is where the aliens are, not over there.
Maybe they're at the Vatican.
Not up the road a bit.
Maybe they're in the Vatican.
Maybe. Who knows?
I don't know.
Kind of. Oh my gosh, we're gonna get into anarcho-Christian post-sadism.
Yeah.
Like this, the space monks come down.
I mean, there's plenty of people who believe all this stuff we talk about of spirituality historically was actually just aliens.
Oh yeah, and there's all sorts of weirdness with that too. Like you know, notice they very rarely talk about the standing stones in Britain or in France, and it's the ever since Von Daniken, since Chariots of the Gods, there's always been a weird racial undercurrent of the ancient aliens thing. But
I never thought about that until now. That's a really good point.
There's a wonderful meme that combines like the Easter Island heads and the step pyramids of Mexico and and a bunch of other things, and it says and the pyramids of Giza, and it just says, just because white people didn't make it doesn't mean it was alien.
Yeah.
I want to fling that at my younger self again. I was looking for wonder, and I didn't care where I found it, and now I care a lot more where I find it.
Yeah, I feel that.
But yeah, there's Jacques Vallée, who is one of these theorists that I got exposed to through Space Monks.
I got that painting
through the Illuminatus trilogy and through the work of Robert Anton Wilson. And Jacques Vallée's thing is that aliens are just our latest metaphor for the same thing that we've been experiencing as angels and spirits and ascended masters and what have you this whole time. He calls them ultra-terrestrials. He thinks that they're nothing that we've theorized so far. And I need to reacquaint myself with his writings, but he's probably got the most interesting of the totalizing metaphors, which is not something I go in for these days because it tends to alienate people.
Yeah.
But also, it's it doesn't seem to jive with my experience of the immense complexity of the world.
It's interesting. Yeah, I feel it. I got that painting from Faith.
Oh yeah.
I think
see.
I'm sharing. I think I'm sharing my screen.
Cool.
Am I sharing it? Yeah, there he is. Yeah, there it is.
Ooh.
Boom.
Nice little color gradient there. Some ombre effects.
There we go.
Yeah.
That's what we inspired.
Abstraction. Yeah, take that, fascism.
Yeah. There we go. Yeah, I feel you.
So is there anything in particular you wanted to ask me? I hope I haven't been babbling too much.
No, not at all. Definitely not.
Appreciate it.
I think, yeah, I have asked a few questions, but I think I don't know. I think we should definitely do another one
about paganism or my practice that I can clarify for you.
Yeah, we should definitely do another stream too on my channel. We could talk more about from your perspective, but I'll ask this too right now. The first question that always comes to mind is, because growing up I was told all this stuff like nature connection rituals and occult and paganism would all get thrown under the label New Age, and so I'm interested in what you think about that label New Age and what it actually is, and if it connects with anything paganism related.
Well, there is a broad connection, generally speaking. So, where to begin? So, a lot of people think that anything pagan is it's going to be really, really old. And actually, a lot of what we consider neo-paganism is either basically Renaissance Kabbalism, Renaissance Hermetic Kabbalah. So partly Jewish, partly classical, partly Christian, practiced originally by monks, and then by upper class fancy lads with nothing better to do, and then finally by weirdos like me. So Hermeticism is based on the Hermetic corpus, which does in fact go back to antiquity, but it really flowered in the medieval era. So it's that Hermetic tradition that gives us most of the New Age stuff. So you have organizations like the Golden Dawn in England, no relation to the Greek fascist party, by the way. I guess there's a limited number of cool sounding names in the world. But you have these old lodge systems. So they're kind of like for people for whom Freemasonry isn't quite geeky enough, and they want to learn, ancient Greek and Hebrew and dress up in Egyptian robes or what have you, and walk around the temple and intone god names. And so it's very indoor magic.
Mm-hmm.
And so from that, you have other systems like the Theosophists with H.P. Blavatsky. She wrote Isis Unveiled. And so as the 19th century is sort of coming to a close, there's this huge flowering of occult writing with Blavatsky and the Golden Dawn in England. Aleister Crowley's part of it. I'm sure I'm sure you heard his name in the ranks of evil.
I haven't.
At some point.
I haven't heard any of these names.
So, and a lot of these teachings were that there's a new era. There's there's some kind of great thing about to happen, or just happened. So in the case of Crowley, his feeling was that the great equinox of the gods has happened, and that the sacrifice of Jesus is no longer the main dish on the buffet of the universe, and that spiritual attainment is no longer about death and rebirth as it was in the old aeon, but now is to be considered like the growth and development of a child. So in his idea, the crowned and conquering child has supplanted the archetype of the dying and reborn God, which is where we get the formulation, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, understanding the will as the core of your being underneath the whims of the moment, very much like your soul, your life mission. So Theosophy and Thelema and these other Hermetic influenced systems got intermingled and mixed around in the early 20th century, and during the 60s got this big shot in the arm from psychedelia and from the New Thought movement, which was more the 20s and 30s, but had this rediscovery cycle. And so what I consider New Age is these teachings that say we're in a new era now, and also that generally muddy cultural waters, whereas your Reconstructionist paganism tries to kind of parse out what was an actual practice and what was a romantic invention of the 19th century, and what was somebody's unsubstantiated personal gnosis, shall we say. So when pagans today go off into the woods and have extraordinary experiences and meet spirits or gods or what have you, the Reconstructionist idea is that's an unsubstantiated personal gnosis. Gnosis in meaning knowledge or experience. And so then when you're processing that, you make reference to whatever texts or traditions or people have informed your practice, to see, to try to verify it, as it were. And it's not terribly scientific, but at the same time, there's a feeling that, the universe might be playing silly buggers with me. I don't want there's a feeling that I don't want to be naive about this, because there's any number of things it could be. I'm a fallible person. I've got buttons that other people could push, and what's to keep a superpowered being from pushing those same buttons. So in the new age milieu, there's less emphasis on the verifying, and as such, there are, sad to say, there's more opportunities for charlatanry and for people to come in and just jerk vulnerable people around for money. So
yeah,
I tend to use New Age, sad to say, in a fairly derogatory manner. Even though the law of Thelema is technically, a New Age doctrine, tangled web. But
yeah,
it's yeah.
It's interesting what you say about it not being, it's tending to not wanting to verify with the historical traditions, because I think that has usually been why I have been uncomfortable with New Age stuff, because I had I have a friend who's really into New Age stuff, and like we're good friends, and we're able to share like our connections spiritually and stuff. And it's funny, like we both have this opposite view, where I've told her, or she's told me, the reason she doesn't really dig Christianity and similar religions is because she doesn't like this idea of, we figured out the truth a long time ago and we're just following what they said, and now it applies to today. And she likes to have like new ideas and stuff. And I said, the reason that I don't like New Age stuff is because I get the vibe that they're saying, after all these millenniums, we figured out the truth all by ourselves. And it's like, so I get annoyed at that, where it's a disconnect from history, and she feels like the other religions is a disconnect from the present. And so it's funny. It's like, it's a cool relationship that way, because we're able to admit those parts of our religions. But I feel like that is something that I think is, I'm immediately uncomfortable when there is that disconnect from the historical traditions, where there is that feeling of, we figured this out by ourselves. And also, even within Protestant evangelicalism, Protestantism is protesting against the Catholic Church, and they kept protesting each other to where we have over 40,000 denominations today, and within Protestantism. And a lot of them sometimes can have that same mindset of, our denomination started 70 years ago because we finally figured out the correct way to do this Christianity thing. And there's a disconnect from the historical Christian tradition. And so it's like, I immediately become very skeptical when I come across spiritual traditions that start with, we figured it out today, this century.
Yeah. it's interesting because there's there's that same tension in the pagan world too. Um, the the Reconstructionists have to be very clear-eyed that, for example, as far as Irish Celtic lore, there's just there's not the same kind of records that there are, say, for Greco-Roman worship, where you know they basically have a couple of empires spreading the worship around, and uh, and so there's a process of feeling out things, and you might do something privately on your own. You might offer something. Uh, you might you might, for example, offer a dish of corn or potatoes, foods that these gods would never have been offered back in the day, um, New World crops, and you might not do that publicly with the group because they have this they have a more traditionalist bent, but you might do that on your own because it's what you have on hand, because it's what you're good at cooking, because you've invented a new recipe and you want to give them a portion. There's room for there's room for messing about even among the traditionalists, and I think it's and among most of the traditionalists, I should say, there are of course groups that are really stone-headed about some things,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just really grateful that those groups aren't the ones with unaccountable power in the community.
Yeah.
That that's the one really lovely thing about having such a disorganized family of religions is the lack of unaccountable power.
That's a good point. Yeah. Yeah. And that is a good point, that we do need that tension together of the people who are saying we have to remember the historical element to this, and people saying, well, how are we going to reinterpret this for today? And people saying like, I think it's so important to be able to say how a lot of ideas that we consider so new and progressive, we could find the stream of that within a lot of our historical teachers, and acknowledge that we're on the same journey that people have been on for all this time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's powerful.
And it's especially powerful for those of us on the left because we're used to seeing our project as a full break with the past, when really that's not even quite it. What we're it's not so much a break with the past as a fulfillment of things that people have been working towards for centuries now. One of my best one of my best performing videos so far is my song about the peasants' revolt in England in 1381. Basically, there were these abusive taxes. The people couldn't stand it, and they were being assaulted in the streets in some cases to see if they were eligible to pay the poll tax. And so Wat Tyler and a bunch of just armies of peasants descended on London, and they very nearly wiped out the institution of serfdom in 1381. And the people on the right wing who think that medieval peasants were just good, loyal Catholic boys and girls who went to retake Jerusalem because Deus Vult and all this stuff, they're deluding themselves. There were factions of the peasants' revolt who didn't just want to get rid of Richard II's corrupt advisors, were carrying out these orders, they wanted to get rid of nobility and the king himself. They wanted to. There were factions that were completely radical, and the same is true in the English Civil War. Same is true in all these different rebellions. The way I see it, leftism is traditional as fuck.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it just hasn't. It's not convenient for those who are traditionally at the top of these unaccountable hierarchies to admit it.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to keep moving. We have to keep evolving. Yeah.
And anything that gets anything that gets a little too hairy gets erased. And it's really awful, because the kind of communities that these reactionaries want end up failing. Monolithic communities, and this is provable. We're talking science for a second. Sorry, folks, but communities that are too monolithic get overconfident,
mm-hmm.
and they fail. And not to get cliche, but diversity really is a strength, and that's true of religious communities, and that's true of political communities as well. And it's easy to see factions endlessly debating one another, but at the same time, we could sit here all night and think of people who were very unified in a completely wrong-headed direction.
Yeah.
So unity is no guarantee that the thing you're unified around is worth your time and energy.
Yeah. Definitely.
Exactly. That's the other thing. The traditions that a lot of these folks lean on are either romantic inventions or just rumors from sources like Tacitus or Caesar, and who, as we mentioned before, had this overwhelming interest to picture the Gauls and the Celts and the Germanic peoples as these warrior these terrible, unstoppable warriors that need to be fought. And it plays into a willingness to make myths about oneself, and which I understand, because I was raised in a suburban environment and felt that everything was boring. I wanted Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And I cannot lie to you and say that had no bearing on my spiritual journey, because it did. That wanting to escape. And that's very much, and it's true of the political stuff too. My least favorite phrase is "that's the way it is," and it's been since I was a kid. And I'm pretty sure the only reason I heard it so much is because I was so damn inquisitive. But I got the feeling that the adults in my life just said "that's the way it is" as a cop-out. And imagine my shock, reading about these alternative political philosophies and religious philosophies that, hey, yeah, the way it is a cop-out. What if we worked a bit harder? What if we got organized? What if we got off our duffs and stopped accepting that silly ass excuse?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to keep moving, keep growing, keep evolving, and I see that too with socialism, where we're acknowledging that it's like we needed to move from feudalism to capitalism because that was the necessary step. But then we keep going and change and shift again, and I think we're both aligned with our religious traditions as well, that we're able to keep growing with that and make transitions and embrace certain things that people within the historical tradition weren't ready for. And so it's very important. Yeah.
And I think it's been really interesting for me seeing how these trends have affected one another. And like you say, I think we are living through the biggest transition as far as just a general moral philosophy since the Reformation, certainly, and the help we're able to give one another now might be, who knows how valuable down the road.
Yeah, definitely. This has been good.
Yeah. We've had a lovely couple of hours together. I don't want to keep you too long, but thanks for joining me. I would love to do a stream over on your channel anytime.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
I was saying on Twitch the other week, because I have some cool pagans following me, I got to do like a pagan arc of my story where I just like talk to multiple pagans, because it's like I think there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had.
Oh, definitely.
So I appreciate you bringing me on and getting all this started for me.
Sure thing. And if you have any other questions for me, once we've wrapped this up, please feel free. And that's both to you and to anybody watching. I'm an open book about all this stuff. And if I can't answer anything, I'll do my best to find a good answer for you.
Awesome. Cool. Everyone go check me out, my channel, Damon Garcia.
Yes.
And who is Dame? Yeah, who is Damon on Twitter?
Excellent content. I've been loving it so far. I can't wait to see what you come out with next, my friend.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Have
a lovely evening.
You too. Bye-bye.